On today's episode of Hollywood Rants, Tales of the Curmudgeon of North Hollywood, we're going to go over the state of the entertainment industry as of February 2021. And what we're going to do is start with a little bit of an overview over what's been happening since the start of the pandemic. As we all know, the pandemic itself has caused incredible disruption within the entertainment industry. For one thing, lots of productions were shut down and weren't able to really begin ramping up again with COVID protocols in place until this summer. And it's amazing how quickly the industry was able to adapt. But that shouldn't come as a surprise because this is the same industry that was able to overcome the coming of sound, the coming of television, home video, cable, disintegration of the foreign market, and any number of other things with aplomb. So it's no surprise that they're leading the way in figuring out how to have a business that's largely based around people being in close contact with one another without necessarily masks to protect them, at least in terms of the above the line, i.e. actor position, that they were able to make it work. Now, it's true that right now in Southern California, there is a movement to shut down the industry again, largely formed by the unions. And this is causing another disruption. And it doesn't hurt the people who are the huge salary workers, the ones who live in the mansions in Beverly Hills, who can afford to sort of be a little bit of virtue signaling about what they're willing to give up. Well, the bottom line is they're really not having to give up a damn thing. While the rest of the below the line workers, the people in the crafts, the people in the theatrical distribution side have been largely ravaged. However, there is hope that a lot of the, shall we say, runaway productions, the ones that are being shot in Georgia, the ones that are being shot out of the country, have really gotten their act together. Now, I know we've heard certain things happening around Tom Cruise's set, but I've got to say, A, that's Italy. B, Tom Cruise was talking about his own money being on the line. And C, there is still a bias, no matter where you go, of being local. In other words, you have Italian workers who are going to live by an Italian system. They're not going to be paying attention much to some rich guy from Hollywood. So it's no wonder that there was some stress involved. And it is unfair to point that at Tom Cruise and say, well, he's just a nut. No, he wasn't. He was protecting his investment. So yeah, maybe he went a little bit over the top, but I'm going to come down on his side on that. Anybody who is trying to keep people employed, keep the craft going, is going to be someone that I champion, at least right now. Now, I'm not saying people who are foolhardy. I'm saying people who follow the right protocols, who understand how to keep people isolated during the times they're going to be working together, and above all, to remain courteous to those who do not have those advantages. An example of where somebody wasn't courteous is recently where we had that studio set up right outside a restaurant that wasn't allowed to serve people out of doors. But here you had an entire catering section set up in the parking lot. Now, I'm not going to say that the restaurant should have been open. I'm going to say that to flagrantly show the industry people being able to do that exact same thing did not make for good optics. Worse, you had people in the industry say, well, first of all, we're better protected and that business has no right to interfere with what we're doing. That was wrong. That's an example of where there's certain aspects of the industry which are behaving rather badly. Now, the good news is that there's one part of the industry that has been to a large degree unaffected by COVID, and that is the world of post-production. I'm not saying it wasn't unaffected, because certainly they need the material coming in. But if you look at how most people who work in post tend to work alone, it was very easy to move their infrastructure, if necessary even, from an office space into home offices. Some of my former graduates actually work as post supervisors, and they have not had a break in employment. They've had to adjust. They've had to get used to continual Zoom meetings. But by the same token, they are able to do their job. And so that's a part of the industry that has remained stable. And that's a good thing, because any part that remains stable is a lightning rod for where opportunities are going to be coming for my students. Other areas that are impacted by the increase in technology is the constant upgrading of cameras and the constant upgrading of styles. And for older cinematographers who've had to do the transition from film to digital, this is not necessarily that big a challenge. Yes, there's a new camera du jour that comes out, it seems like, almost every other week. Ditto for the kinds of resolution you have. Originally, it was just high def, then it moved to 2K, then 4K, now 8K. And a lot of that has been a boon, because the more information you have, the better, because the more you can manipulate it without loss, the more you can cut in to, let's say, a 4K or an 8K original image and have enough detail to where if you project it at 2K, you're still getting the full resolution of what that format supports. It's even better than the old days of feature film, where if you had an optical of any sort, it was down a couple of generations and very noticeable if you happened to be lucky enough to see something that was made off an interpositive, which is directly from the negative. By the time prints got to theaters, they were usually 4 generations down in the old days of film. So the difference in quality between an effect shot, which included dissolves, which included any kind of special effect, were by that point almost as far down in terms of generations as were the original story material, the original storytelling scenes were almost as far down in terms of multi-generation. You still had similar amounts of grain, you still had certain amounts of higher contrast and all of that. So it wasn't noticeable. But if you've ever seen a restoration of an old movie and you notice that whenever a dissolve comes up or whenever there's an optical, it looks remarkably worse. Well, that was a fingerprint of old film technology that isn't there in digital. However, there's a dark side to this, and that is that very often you will have the filmmakers shoot on 4K or 8K, and on the producer level, believe the publicity that all you need to do is take that wider shot and punch in on it, and you will have the exact same thing as if you went in and got closer and closer and closer shots. This is not true, because for a good cinematographer, for a director who really wants to capture the right emotions, you really don't want to be punching in on shots that are lit for something that's further back. The reason you shoot something in a segmented format out of order is to create that emotional connection between the character and the presentation. And that can only be done if you're actually doing close-up up close, because you adjust the lighting. And the further erosion of this is where you'll have someone say, well, it doesn't matter because we'll just use Lightbox and go in there and relight it later. Okay, let's get real here. One of the problems with digital technology is it outdates extraordinarily quickly. So a fix like going in and removing someone's beard or something like that might be clever and might even be worthy of $1 million or so worth of free publicity, maybe even more than that. But the danger is you go out 3 or 4 years and now you see the fingerprints of that digital manipulation. And now it looks terrible. And it looks terrible in a way that old school opticals don't. And that is one of the reasons why when you look at something like Titanic, those initially impressive special effects from 24 years ago now don't look that much better than Journey to the Center of the Earth from the 1950s. You notice that the water looks wrong. You notice all sorts of things that in 1997 were still very impressive. You also have the business side of what's happened during the pandemic, and that is the shutting down of theatrical. And this is actually more disastrous than it might sound on the surface. And the reason for that is because the upper end of the business, the real moneymakers, the actors who make 40 or $50 million a pop, the directors who have these enormous salaries, all of that is predicated on a theatrical release. Now, why do I say that's predicated on a theatrical release? It's because that theatrical release will drive the rest. Why? Because it's a unique experience. It's something that you're doing exclusively. It's something that, yes, you're doing it in an audience of X number of thousands of people, and you're dreaming together in the dark. So there's a communal aspect of it. Secondarily, there's a scale aspect. Watching something on the big screen, you are surrounded by that image in a darkened room. And not only are you surrounded by that image in a darkened room, your entire attention is focused on the screen in what is called gaze mode. And what gaze mode means is that all of your attention is there. So you will notice subtlety and nuance. And somebody might say, well, in the days of flat panel projection, we have that. We're not stuck with a 25-inch TV at 240i as being the highest form of resolution that's possible. No, we've got high definition. Yes, but you are still at home. It is still something where it's not a special event. It's something where you're not having that communal and somewhat limited experience, even though it's a limited experience you're sharing with millions of others. It's something where the size and the dimensions of the experience has been reduced. Because let's face it, how many people, even in the most elaborate man caves, have something that approximates a movie theater? Yeah, some rich people do, but by and large, even if you're watching a 72-inch screen, that 72-inch screen is usually in a room that's fairly well lighted. It's also in a room where you have other family members. It's also in a room where you're usually not totally focused on the image. You're in glance mode. And that means you're going to be paying attention to the dog. You're going to be paying attention to the kids. You're going to say, oh my God, I got to do the laundry. Oh, can you pause it for a minute? I got to go. So, oh, and I got a phone call. Oh, let me check my text. You are in a zone where you are not totally sucked into the movie. So something like Wonder Woman 84, which might have been passable theatrically, at home, without the benefit of having that sense memory of what it was like to see projected, you're now seeing something that's been extraordinarily reduced in scope. And you have an opportunity to feel its length. And that is a negative. Now, we have the issue of HBO Max going out there and saying, we're not going to even consider an exclusive theatrical window anymore. Instead, at least for the duration of the pandemic, what we're going to do is we're going to release the film day and date in those venues that can actually do theatrical screening with its premiere on HBO Max. It will be on HBO Max for approximately 30 days. And during that 30 days, those who are subscribed to HBO Max have an ability to be part of that initial exclusive audience. And what we've seen happen with Wonder Woman is it didn't do well. It was supposed to drive up membership, but because we're only there for 1 month, we have to assume in order to have that work as a true profit center, that Wonder Woman needed to attract 500,000 people who subscribed just because of Wonder Woman. And not only that, they couldn't just stay for that 1 month. They need to stay for a period of 5 years. At that point, if they've stayed for 5 years exclusively because of Wonder Woman, the economic return is satisfied. It is now in profit. Because let's face it, once you go into the secondary runs on the Amazon Primes and all of that, you've moved out of that initial window and you're now looking at your secondary and perhaps even tertiary income. But because Wonder Woman, even in its theatrical venues, fell apart in its second week cataclysmically, you're seeing a film that isn't necessarily going to have those legs. So it's unlikely that you will have someone who subscribed to HBO Max on the strength of that one movie and stay for 5 years. Ditto for every other Warner Brothers released, supposedly formerly theatrical released picture. Note what happened with Godzilla versus Kong. Now, Godzilla versus Kong was a pickup for HBO Max, for Warner Brothers. It was picked up from Legendary. Legendary was one of the companies that, as soon as HBO Max announced its plans, filed a suit for breach of contract. Now, why did they file a suit for breach of contract? Because once it gets exposed on a streaming service, that epic scope of the movie is going to be lost. Forget that you're going to be able to do a IMAX release in the future. Note too that Legendary pulled back on that lawsuit fairly quickly. And you might say, well, why did they do that? Why did they agree not only to allow that film to be played on HBO Max, but they also allowed it to be pulled up by 2 months. So now it's going to debut in March. I'm going to posit a guess here, and I'm going to say that the reason they did that is because the film is not good. Now, why do I say that? I used to work in market research, and in order for a film to really be a hit, you do the research and see that the audience is rating the film excellent at a very high level, meaning that more than about 30% of the audience rates it excellent. Not very good, not top 2 box, excellent and very good put together. No, just excellent. Needs to be above the norm. The higher above the norm, the better. Let's say that you had 50% of the people saying it was very good and 10% of the people saying it was excellent. That top 2 box is 60%, which is slightly higher than the norm for a top 2 box. But the excellents were low, which probably means the definite recommends are low. And that means that the movie is not loved. And what's the difference between a movie that's loved and a movie that's liked? A movie that's loved, when somebody sees it, will go to their friends and say, you've got to see this right away, and I will go and see it a second time. You get your repeat viewings and you have enthusiasm, which will drive people to go at those initial outings. If the movie, on the other hand, is just sort of, it's okay, what does that say to your friends? First of all, you're not going to be proactive and say, look at what I saw last night. No, you're probably going to not even remember it until someone says, hey, did you see Godzilla versus Kong? You said you were going to watch it. And you go, oh yeah, it was okay. Even though you rated it very good, because you don't have a passion for it. And that's the problem. Look at how The Mandalorian has done for Disney Plus. Look at how WandaVision is doing now. Those are examples of things that have extraordinarily strong word of mouth. Now, they're still problematic for Disney because they don't really have that many episodes. So you're still going to have those gaps between the time those 2 series end and the time they start up again. And during that period, Disney Plus has a gap as well, where most of its viewers are not loyal. And that means that over time, while Disney Plus is going to have a large number of viewers from year to year and from month to month, the consistent subscribers are not there. So how much do they grow in terms of subscriber revenue from month to month? It's probably very little relative to the number of people who actually subscribe. Now, I haven't seen their most recent books, but I'm going to bet that a lot of the reporting is based on new subscribers, not on people who necessarily stayed with the service for an entire year and what that growth rate was. Because, yes, the more viewers you have, the better. But at a certain point, if people are only going to subscribe for short windows when you have certain content available and then drop right after and then pick up again later, that's going to mean that you don't necessarily have that large an infrastructure of viewers. It's very interesting to follow what's being reported in the entertainment trades. There's a lot of talk about how streaming services in general now accounted for $21 billion in revenue. That sounds super impressive, right? How much money was spent to create that content? This is a troublesome issue, especially because when we look at all of that money that's coming in, it has to be more, or at least be projected to be more sooner or later, relative to the amount that's going out. But look at Netflix. What has Netflix done fairly recently? Netflix has said yes to, I believe it's 70 new film events. How much do each of those cost? How much does the 600 series that Netflix currently have on their books cost? Now, admittedly, they have a lot of revenue coming in on a month-by-month basis with their nearly 300 million people worldwide as subscribers. But their model is based on ever-increasing revenues. And we've seen, even during pandemic, while there was an initial boost in the number of people who were subscribing to Netflix, that number has kind of leveled off. Moreover, the actual percentage of new people who have joined in and subscribed to HBO Max or Apple Plus or Disney Plus or any of the other services has not really been increasing overall beyond the general numbers that Netflix had been increasing by when it was the only game in town. That is giving us a hint that perhaps the goose that laid the golden egg, streaming, is reaching the point of saturation. This is bad because with the extra amounts of money that are being spent on all of the new streaming projects, we're now faced with a situation where there's no money coming in to support that increase in money that's going out. Netflix already has an incredible amount of debt that, because it's a one-trick pony, all it does is movies and streaming content. It doesn't have a wide base to tackle a massive loss. Apple Plus, on the other hand, and Amazon Prime are very minor parts of much larger corporations, which have, well, to be brutally grotesque about it, FU money. So they're much better positioned to be able to survive. Now we have another issue that's rearing its ugly head, and that is what kind of content is being produced. We've already seen that Disney Plus made a mistake by spending $200 billion for Mulan in an attempt to become the de facto provider of a lot of Western content into China. But that movie was a very, very bad hybrid. What do I mean by that? Well, on the one hand, the movie was supposedly geared so heavily toward the Chinese audience that it took out certain favored characters from the former animated version of the story. And they kind of took out the romantic part. Okay, now you've created a problem in the home country, which is the United States. But clearly Disney just like some of the big tech companies, is not that interested in their home country. They're looking at China, which has a population that's more than twice of the United States and Europe combined, as being who they really want to target. So they're creating content that more or less conforms to China's rules. It's as if we had the 1934 production code with its list of do's and don'ts reinstated, not even from the United States. It's being reinstated from a foreign country. So this is a challenge. Now, what's the bad side of this? Did the film work for China? No. Why? Because it had mostly American crew and American style storytelling behind it. If we want to talk about colonialist attitudes, perhaps the worst colonialist attitude in terms of art is that all art is based on the Greek system, the three-part dramatic structure. It's not true for the Far East or for India or for Africa. Most of the non-Abrahamic religion countries do not view the world the same way and therefore don't tell stories the same way. But the arrogance of Disney was to make this movie for China, in English, with American visualization techniques, the orientation of the way action happens on the screen, and American style storytelling, and imposing that on an actual Chinese legend. Now, I can tell you when I watch anything about Japanese culture, this is perhaps because I lived in Japan, albeit I haven't been there for 38 years. But when I see anything that's made in the West that has anything to do with Japan, all I see are the details that got wrong. And it's not because the American production designers weren't on their toes. It's because there's certain things that unless you live in that culture, you just don't know it. And the attitude has always been, well, so what? That's only one territory. That's fine. But that's assuming that the rest of the world is more important than that territory. And in this case, if you're saying that China is more important than the United States and Europe, and now you've done something that's fakakta for China, you now have created a product that has no audience. And that's the danger of what's happening with a lot of the content that's being directed towards the Chinese viewer rather than the Western viewer. We can even carry that further. Look what happened with the new sequel to Top Gun. It CG'd out patches on Tom Cruise's jacket that were the Taiwanese flag, simply because China didn't like that. Mistake that Paramount gave in to that. And yet the studios are still following that mantra. What I don't think most Westerners realize is China is looking at America and saying, you thought you were smarter than us. Our civilization is thousands of years older than Western civilization. We know where you're coming from before you even think you've started on the journey. So don't think that we're stupid and we're just Mr. Moneybags for your profligacy. We'll give you a little bit of rope and then you're going to hang yourself, which in fact Disney has done. I don't believe Bob Iger left only because some of the issues that have come up, because Disney is no longer able to have $30 million a day come in from parks revenue. That's huge. I mean, that was able to cover up all the cockamamie stuff that was going on with Lucasfilm and with some of the things that have been attempted with the Marvel Universe outside of the big Avengers type films. It's that it's that you have only one of its parks in the US open. It's that you only have one of its parks in China open. And again, both of those are on limited admittance. So now people are paying attention to Disney's operations, whereas for years, all they were interested in were its financials as it got bigger and bigger and bigger. It was at the point even where Disney spent $72 billion to acquire Fox. And in the process of acquiring Fox, they didn't even get Fox News or Fox Network. nor did they get the land that underlies it. Now, you might say they still got so many other assets. After all, they have all the Shirley Temple movies and the Alien movies and the Star Wars and all of this. But the entire operation in 2017, and that includes the land, that includes the networks, was valued at $41 billion. So Disney paid a real premium for that. Doesn't matter as long as the revenues are coming in and you have so much money from the parks. It does matter when we're in pandemic, you don't have theatrical releases, and now all of a sudden your cash flow is crunched and people start looking at where your money is really going, who your managers are, and why is it that you're alienating your viewer base, which Disney is. So we're seeing a lot of missteps happening in the world of the big corporate side. Now let's move over to AT&T and Warner Brothers. Initially, when AT&T bought Warner Brothers, it looked like a merger made in heaven because you're aligning two companies that have similar goals in the same way that when Universal aligned with Comcast, it made sense. And I'll admit I was wrong about that because I initially thought, well, Comcast had to be pretty much lent money by GE, and Universal had to come up with, the NBC side had to come up with this cockamamie scheme to have Jay Leno do a musical variety show just so that they could save money on their development of their primetime schedule for 1 year so that the dollars would make sense. But Comcast understood the importance of having audience savvy content. And so that merger has turned out to be very good. Well, at least until the president of MCA Universal decided he couldn't keep it in his pants with the same woman who brought down Kevin Tsujihara of Warner Brothers just a couple of years after and wound up being Me Too'd out of his job. I don't know who they've gotten to replace him, but it's still ongoing. But that should have been the same situation with AT&T and Warner Brothers. But what's happened there? Well, first of all, AT&T bought Warner Brothers when it was at the top. They closed the deal shortly after Joker was a success, shortly after Game of Thrones was set to launch its final season, or maybe it was in the middle of its final season. So it looked like the company was flying high. But Warner Brothers had operational problems as well. First of all, Game of Thrones' last season was messed up. And so that meant that all of these sequels that were planned for it, all of these sequels and prequels and ways of keeping that franchise going were shot. And that was over $1 billion right there. Bye-bye. Meanwhile, following up on Joker, did Warner Brothers learn the lesson that Joker provided on how to do content that audiences love? No. What Warner Brothers did is it did Birds of Prey, and it did a number of TV shows that didn't work. And worse than that, its attempt to get the DC universe to conform with current political trends that are largely supported on Twitter and very little anywhere else has limited the appeal for a lot of the core original comic book side of it, which in turn was supposed to drive the later series and feature films. So now we have a massive disaster happening at Warner Brothers in case of its operations as well. So as we can see, there's some very, very significant stress points in the industry right now. Streaming is perhaps not going to be as lucrative as people felt it was going to be. And I'm not saying it's not lucrative. I'm saying it's not as lucrative as people thought it was going to be. So that's going to create an uncomfortable point. Now you have AT&T having the same issue. Fortunately, Universal is doing fine. Fortunately, Sony is doing fine. And by the way, I had not known this before, but Sony, even in Japan, is not so heavily invested in electronics and in their film production anymore. I mean, they're not going to stop doing that because after all, hokori for the company and pride and all of that. But their real business now that's making them a lot of money is in insurance, is in medical insurance, and especially for retired people, older people. But they're not going to lose what they were known for. So this is probably why Apple didn't close a deal with buying Sony, because they were probably looking at Sony as being an electronics titan in Japan, as well as the US and the worldwide. But they weren't interested in buying a company that, despite the real estate holdings in the United States, is in a business that they are not. Apple has not expanded enough to be really interested in real estate and insurance. So especially not offshore. So that was probably the reason that fell apart. But Sony cut back on its disastrous Amy Pascal years and has focused on its hard assets that return profit. And that's why I think long term they're in a comfortable position. We do see many of the majors on the verge of becoming mini majors, in the same way that MGM went from Hollywood's prime studio to being a mini major with one big piece of IP that still generates a fortune, which of course is the James Bond franchise. Note that there's challenges with the new James Bond movie, that there's feelings that they're trying to hold it for theatrical, but at the same time, there's a sense that there might have been some audience alienation involved in it in its attempt to update the James Bond character and introduce a Black female James Bond. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it shows a progression, but it's not been positioned properly in terms of the press. It's presented aggressively. It's presented as an in-your-face move, which is a mistake. Remember, your audience does not really change over time. You might want it to, but you have to go with who your audience really is. Your audience isn't who you'd like it to be. So stop it. Stop trying to find people who are never going to be your audience and appease them. Stick with the ones who are giving you your money. So this sounds like it's largely negative, but it's not, because there's all sorts of positives that are coming down the pike. The largest of the positives, perhaps, was the fact that the agencies, the big five, are no longer able to just ram through anything they want in terms of packages where they get a percentage of the budget and a big piece of the back end. Let's get real. Where's that money actually come from? You're right, it comes from their talent. It comes from the people they've put in that package, because every dollar that's going to the agency in terms of that package deal, in terms of that back-end participation, is coming from their above-the-line talent. And this is why new talent had not been built in terms of any position, whether it be directors, whether it be writers, whether it be producers, whether it be actors, whether it be below the line people, the cinematographers, the production designers, the costume designers, the editors. All of those positions were impacted by this packaging scheme, where you were having people pulled out of the mid-sized and the smaller boutique agencies and lured into the big ones, not so that they could have their career built, but so they could be removed from competition for their larger name talent. So the fact that the Writers Guild held firm on their demand that this be stopped has been a win, because what's happened is that even though the agencies have regrouped and said, well, it doesn't matter with our 10%, we're actually going to be making more money than before. No, you're not. Your IPOs have all blown up because of this. You are going to take your companies public with the idea that you were not only going to be packaging, but that you were going to actually start physical production, flying in the face of the 1962 MCA decree, which said, as a talent agency, you cannot do this. And yet people released IPOs where that was part of the IPO, and everyone's going, what are you doing? This is violating of laws. So this has been a big disaster for the agency. So don't believe that those 50% of the people who've been churned out largely from this sector of the industry are going to be coming back tomorrow. I'm going to say that a lot of them are likely going to be forming their own mid-sized agencies and going back to doing business the traditional way, or maybe leaving the industry. But what this opens up is that it opens up the ability to build new talent. It opens up the ability to go after content that is good rather than content that is merely expensive. And it also allows for more of a true diversity in what that content will contain. And when I say diversity, I don't mean putting Queen Latifah in the new TV series based on The Enforcer. No, you actually create content for the talent specifically. You create something original, not a reboot, not a remake, not a relaunch, but an actual piece of original content. That's what gets viewers going. Remember how I said that Netflix has a problem in that it has a lot of series, and that within a lot of those series, you don't even know they exist. But what do you notice exists? Yes, something like Queen's Gambit had very positive word of mouth. And because of that positive word of mouth, people saw this show that was a unique little gem that wasn't necessarily ridiculously expensive and delivered in a strong way. That is something that's possible when you have a focus on content rather than being broader and looking at things exclusively from a PowerPoint perspective where everything has to be high bling. So what does this mean for people who are looking at entering the industry right now? I'm going to not lie to you, and I'm going to say that it's going to be tough for a minute. But it's always tough. It's never been easy in the industry. I mean, ever since George Méliès had his camera jam and a bus turned into a hearse, and all of a sudden special effects were manufactured. Every time something changes in the industry, it becomes tough for people who are used to things the way they were before. And you just have to be adaptable to it. The number one way that new movements happen in the industry is usually through the lower budgets. Look at the transition in the late 60s and early 70s when you had the film school geeks coming in through the Roger Corman type companies. And these were the Francis Ford Coppolas and the Martin Scorseses and the Steven Spielbergs who learned their tricks in the upheaval that happened when all the musicals were collapsing at the same time. And too much money was spent on surefire things that ended up not being so surefire. The obvious answer to this is look at how important YouTube has become. And one of the joys of YouTube is that you see a lot of creators find their audience in ways that the big networks don't have. I'm going to say here that Google's making a phenomenal mistake by trying to go in there and suppress out these independent voices in favor of clip shows from the networks. But we understand that Google now feels that it wants to compete through YouTube with Netflix. In fact, they used to say it all the time. But after Cobra Kai stubbornly refused to suddenly flip the platform over through YouTube Red and now YouTube Premium to being a creator of high-end content that was largely studio-oriented, it has embarked on this way of not encouraging new voices to come in. And I remember 5-6 years ago, you had Kickstarter campaigns, all sorts of things where people were trying to do expensive, almost cable level quality content for the YouTube dollars from the partnership program. But since their partnership program has become so fickle, this has not turned out to be something where the VC money is going right now. But we're seeing alternative platforms pop up. Whether they ultimately succeed or whether they go like Parler and disappear, Who knows? But the fact is that entrepreneurial money is going to go somewhere. That entrepreneurial spirit that created those PewDiePies and Logan Pauls and Phil DeFrancos and all that is still out there. They're just a little bit nervous because you don't want to put millions of dollars into something that then gets deplatformed and you're gone. So this is something where the opportunity is there. It's still there in terms of the YouTube platform as well, but it does require a little bit more assertiveness on your own part as a creator. Anyway, this is the state of the industry as it is right now. It is largely positive, even though momentarily it's very negative. Bottom line is they're figuring COVID out. Bottom line is the opportunities for new and original content is rising, especially because there's big swatches of the US population that feels that other than network programming, they're being ignored. And so these gaps